Gentlemen, I am proud to read the citation for my grandfather, John McLean Young. John McLean Young, the future Secretary of the Constitutional Convention of this state, came to Kingfisher, Oklahoma in 1891. He was then 19 years old. Preceding generations of Mr. Young's family had migrated westward, starting in Massachusetts and going from there to Virginia and then to Illinois, where Mr. Young was born on December 29, 1872. While still a minor, Mr. Young played an active role in opening up Oklahoma territory. The story of a major part of Mr. Young's life in Oklahoma is, in large part, the story of the creation of this state. In 1893, John Young, mounted on a quarter horse trained for endurance, lined up with thousands of others, and at the sound of a gunshot, rode into the Cherokee Strip and staked a claim 3 miles east of Phoenix. During the ride, he encountered men who had prematurely and unlawfully entered the Strip under cover of nightfall. They were called Sooners. Mr. Young's claim near Enid was later invalidated because he was then a minor, but he got his revenge by marrying the daughter of the man who took his claim. Mr. Young practiced law in Enid from 1897 until 1901, when he left Enid to venture into the Indian country of southwest Oklahoma, soon to be opened, and settled in a town called Lawton. He remembers it as a town seething with new business and preyed upon by roaming outlaw gangs. In Lawton, as a member of the Democratic Territorial Committee, Mr. Young was appointed to organize the Democratic Party in this new part of Oklahoma. In 1901, state committeemen told Mr. Young that he could run unopposed for territorial senator. He declined this office and used his influence to nominate a man whom he thought had the makings of a great statesman, Thomas Pryor Gore. Senator Gore attributed much of his political success to his lifelong friend, Mr. Young, who was a close friend of every political leader in the state. Statehood was not far off, and in 1906 the Constitutional Convention, composed of delegates from the Indian and Oklahoma territories, assembled in the Brooks Opera House to draft the Constitution. John Young, by years the youngest member, was elected Secretary of the Convention by acclamation. An excerpt from the History of Oklahoma reads, "The busiest man throughout the session of the convention was the Secretary, upon whom devolved so much of the actual labor of drafting the new Constitution. All agreed that it was a wise choice that selected John McLean Young, a rising young lawyer of Lawton, for the responsible position of Secretary. And in the future, when this convention and its work shall have become historic, it will be just that his services receive a due share of the honor bestowed upon the convention." 130 days later, despite pressure from lobbyists and from those who wished to make the Indian Territory into a separate state, the Constitution of Oklahoma was signed and submitted to President Theodore Roosevelt. In 1933, Mr. Young was called to Washington by President Franklin Roosevelt and put in charge of reopening the hundreds of banks that had been closed by presidential proclamation due to the Depression. He had an illustrious career with the banking department until 1941. John Young has said that being Secretary of the Constitutional Convention was his greatest day. If so, this is perhaps his proudest day. Oklahoma should be proud to recognize this man who, in a life spanning a century, has displayed the great frontier qualities of pride, restlessness, courage, competence, and self-reliance that brought this state into being. It is with unusual pleasure that I at this time present my grandfather for induction into the Oklahoma Hall of Fame. Governor Hall, ladies and gentlemen, I present Mrs. Frederick T Walters, who with vision and energy has given of her time and talent to her home city of Tulsa and her beloved state of Oklahoma. Mrs. Walters carries on the standard of excellence set by her parents. With her sister, Mrs. James A. Chapman, she is a major factor in education, church, civic, and medical endeavors in Oklahoma and the Southwest. In the annals of Southwestern philanthropy, the contribution of this family is extraordinary. The Oklahoma Hall of Fame has recognized this by honoring, for the first time in its long history, each member of this family. Pauline McFarland Walter is the daughter of Robert and Ida McFarland, who came to Norman in 1892, where she was born. Widowed in 1964, Mrs. Walter is a mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. For many years, she owned and operated the McFarland Ranch near Inola. Mrs. Walter's leadership was instrumental in planning and funding of the Holland Hall Upper School campus, opened in 1970. She has been associated with the school since its founding in 1922 and is currently an active trustee of this Episcopal-affiliated private school. The Episcopal Conference Center near Seminole, St. Crispin, was commenced with her support for basic utilities. Seed money and time and talent have gone to many church endeavors, including her home church, Trinity of Tulsa. Mrs. Walter is an active board member of St. Simeon's Home for the Aged. In 1966, she created an endowment trust for the support of this outstanding Episcopal institution. Mrs. Walter is a sustaining member of the Junior League. During her period of leadership, she, together with her mother and sister, encouraged and financially supported the founding and the continued operation of the Children's Medical Center. Universities in Oklahoma and Texas have received her interest and support. In the early 60s, she, together with the Chapman McFarland Barnett interest, contributed to Chapman Graduate Center, Trinity University, San Antonio. In 1964, she aided in the major renovation of the McFarland Auditorium, Southern Methodist University. Recently, Mrs. Walter and her sister established a trust fund to support the McFarland Auditorium. In 1966, she contributed to the modernization of McFarland Library at the University of Tulsa. Mrs. Walter visualized and encouraged the gift of Harl Weldon to the Arts Council of Tulsa, and she and her sister completely renovated the 30-room Tudor mansion, which functions effectively as the cultural center of her city. The McFarland family can be likened to a tree with deep roots in Oklahoma life, roots from territorial days, town building, ranching, and oil. It branched out with financial success and civic involvement for more than 60 years. It has borne fruit, its fruit being the spirit of giving. The McFarland family has influenced in a fine and consistent way the better life of this state, and Pauline McFarland Walter is continuing this outstanding tradition. It is an honor for me to present Mrs. Frederick T Walters for an induction to the Oklahoma Hall of Fame.
Master Kennedy, in case we've overlooked you, Governor and Mrs. Hall, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, the Honorable Carl Albert, regrets that he is not able to personally participate in these presentations this evening. It is indeed an honor that the Speaker has requested me to read the following citation to our true and longtime friend, the Honorable Tom Steed. Oklahoma Hall of Fame citation for Honorable Tom Steed, November 16, 1971. It is not possible for me to write a citation of Representative Tom Steed without liberal use of the personal pronouns. Our paths have crossed and our lives intertwined since we were youth. Tom Steed was a cub reporter with the McAllister News Capital, only a few years older than I, when he wrote what was probably the first news story I ever received. I was then a McAllister High School debater. Tom got his start as a journalist on the Ava Evening News and later reported for the Bartlesville Examiner, the McAllister News Capital, the Daily Oklahoman, and the Shawnee News Star. World War II set us off in rather different directions. I to Camp Polk, Louisiana, Washington, D.C., and the South Pacific, and Tom to the West Coast as an anti-aircraft artillery officer, and later to the China-India-Burma Theater for the Office of War Information. His wartime experiences and his Oklahoma background combined to make Tom one of Capitol Hill's legendary storytellers. Tom's ability to articulate is matched only by his perseverance, as his colleagues in the House have reason to know. Elected in 1948, his service is only one term short of matching my own. In his early service, in addition to representing adjacent districts, Tom and I were practically next-door neighbors in the House office building. He is the leader of the Oklahoma congressional delegation, and he was my campaign manager when I ran for majority leader and again for speaker. He delivered the votes for me, and after 12 consecutive terms and difficult redistricting problems, there is no doubt that Tom can also hold his own at the polls. There is no magic about this. He does it by sheer hard work and productive effort. Tom Steed is the only Oklahoman serving on the Appropriations Committee in either body of Congress. He chairs the Treasury Post Office General Government Subcommittee, which earmarks funds in excess of $27 billion annually. His position on this powerful committee enables him to assist with the budget items for our state, which includes defense, water resources development, and agricultural research. We depend upon Tom to carry the ball when Oklahoma projects must be funded. He looks after Oklahoma federal establishments in his district and in other parts of the state as well. His committee has the entire responsibility for funding water development projects nationwide. Tom was a co-author of the Small Watershed Act of 1954. Oklahoma recently dedicated its 1,500th project built under this program. He has worked for the related Ouachita Valley program and for establishment and enlargement of Southern Great Plains Research Center at Chickasha. As a former member of the Public Works Committee, he helped write the $51 billion Interstate Highway Act, the largest peacetime public works measure in history. under which our interstate system and expanded primary and farm-to-market road systems is being built. Tom is a friend of the farmer, the cotton, wheat, and peanut grower, the cattle and dairy men, and an advocate of rural development. He has sponsored legislation or handled appropriations by assisting with budget items earmarked for the state in all these fields. And he is also co-author of the Impacted Aid Program to provide federal monies in lieu of taxes to schools with enrollment swollen by untaxed federal installations. Public works programs for which he has co-authored bills include Mountain Park Dam and Markham Ferry. It was recently my privilege to support a bill to rename Mountain Park the Tom Steed Reservoir, and I'm sure the Congress will support this well-earned tribute. Tom's service has brought many improvements to Oklahoma, many benefits to the nation. A professional journalist, he later became a statesman, a common change for occupation, usually motivated by a highly developed sense of social responsibility. He is one of the top men in Congress today and must be ranked as one of the greatest legislators our state has ever produced. In my judgment, that sums up my friend and colleague, Tom Steed. His sense of responsibility and the accomplishments it produced for his district, his state, his nation, place him perforce in the Hall of Fame. His wonderful wife, Hazel, and fine son, Richard, and his wife, Maureen, and his talented and outstanding grandchildren, supportive, understanding, and aiding, truly belong there with him. Tom's sacrifices have been their sacrifices. His accomplishments, their accomplishments. It is my privilege and my great pleasure to cite my colleague, my friend, a great Oklahoman and a great American for induction into the Oklahoma Hall of Fame, signed Carl Albert. Thank you.
I apologize. Mrs. Cross and I didn't have an opportunity to rehearse this evening. A wonderful evening. An evening in which we've seen greatness in the form of varied and tremendous backgrounds of each one of these people. An evening to honor the experience gained in the past, the recognition that happens in the present, and an inspiration to those who come in the future. Oklahoma just isn't today. It's, as we call it, tomorrow country. It's the kind of excitement that Dr. Cross and the others who put together this evening bring to us in the most dramatic fashion that it could be done, in honoring the greatness of our men and women in this state. I don't think there's anywhere in America that I've been, seen, or heard about that can produce the kind of men and women that were honored here tonight and have been honored in the years past by this wonderful Oklahoma Heritage Association. It's truly... It's truly the greatest honor our state can bestow upon its citizens. It's well deserved by every member honored tonight and every one of those who have been honored in years past. I want to thank you for my participation as the chief executive of this state, because I've seen the number one people introduced, and I know that that same inspiration will carry over till a week from Thursday. I want to tell you, when I was in the Soviet Union, I bragged about Big Red the whole time I was there. And they thought I was talking about one of their teams. The Lord's good to Oklahoma. He's good to each one of us. These honorees deserve your great recognition. God bless you all, and it's a pleasure to be with you tonight. Thank you.
This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. The date is November 17th, 1971, the day after Oklahoma's 64th birthday. We are in the day following the Oklahoma Hall of Fame dinner, and one of the 9 people who was inducted last night into the Oklahoma Hall of Fame was the last original member of the Constitutional Convention who served as secretary of the Constitutional Convention, which began in 1906 and which ended in 1907. We will talk with, this man's name is Mr. John M. Young. We will talk first about the Constitutional Convention, then we'll talk about some of his many other activities in the very, very early days of Oklahoma Territory and of the state of Oklahoma. Mr. Young, I wonder to begin with if you would tell us where you were born, when you were born, who your parents were, and then when you came into the Oklahoma Territory.
Well, I was born in Pana, Illinois. That's in Christian County, and Pana is known as the City of Roses. And later, we moved to Paris, Illinois. And then from there, and after years, my parents moved to Medicine Lodge, Kansas. But when they heard of this proposed opening of the Cherokee Strip and read the history of so up to date of the territory of Oklahoma, my father was very much interested in moving to Oklahoma. So we moved there in 1901 in the early part of January, which was just 2 weeks past my 18th birthday.
Now we're going to skip from this point. We'll go back into the Cherokee Strip and some of those things, but we will. I'd like to take what is probably the most important single portion that you played, and that is as the Secretary of the Constitutional Convention. And I wonder if you might just tell us a little about the Oklahoma Constitutional Convention as you experienced it.
Well, it's hard to stop on just a little, because it was such an important, gigantic thing that I think we ought to rather extend on it. Up to that date, it had been the most important thing in my life. And the Congress of the United States, on the 16th day of June, 1906, passed what was called the Enabling Act. And that provided for the election of 55 delegates from the Indian Territory, 55 delegates from the Oklahoma Territory, and 2 from the Osage Nation. The election was held, and as a result, there were 99 Democrats elected, 1 independent, and 12 Republicans, who, through the convention, were known as the Disciples. We met for the organizational purposes of the convention in the Brooks Opera House in Yesser, Oklahoma. And the reason for procuring the Opera House was so that hundreds of interested citizens could go there and see the delegates in action and witness the organization of the convention. The first order of business was, of course, an invocation, and that was given by Reverend Frank Naylor, who later became chaplain of the convention. And I won't repeat the prayer, but I want to repeat the last words of it, which was as follows: Lord, while we for mankind we pray, of every clime and coast, oh, hear us from our native land, the land we love the most. After the invocation, the order was to elect the officers of the convention, and Mr. William H. Murray, lovingly known by his friends as Alfalfa Bill, was elected president of the convention. After that, a delegate arose from the Indian Territory, obtained permission from the chair to address it, and he placed in nomination as Secretary of the Convention John McLean Young, a young lawyer from Lawton, Oklahoma. And he moved at the same time that the nominations closed and that Mr. Young be elected by acclamation.
Had you had an earlier he knew you obviously earlier, or knew of you.
No, I'm going to tell you.
Oh, all right.
So far as I was concerned, I did not know one single delegate in the Indian Territory, and not all of them in Oklahoma Territory, although I'd taken an active part in the election of delegates to try to see that we got men of ability and stamina and men who would write a good constitution. So far as being secretary is concerned, I had never mentioned the fact to a living soul, and nobody had ever mentioned it to me. And how they picked me as a secretary, I will never know, but evidently it was the organization was all talked over in advance, and it happened just that way. Now, we elected the other officers of the convention, that is, those who were to be elected, and W.A. Durant, who was then the Speaker of the House of the Choctaw Indians, was elected Sergeant Arms. And, as I said before, Reverend Naylor was elected chaplain of the convention. These men seemed to have a job before them, and they immediately embraced the idea of getting to work. And I was fearful of trying to serve the type of men that was in the convention, because it just looked to me like they were all stalwart, strong-minded, and men who realized the importance of the job they had to do and got after it. And I was, of course, considerable years younger than the delegates, and therefore I am now the only living man in the official family of the Constitutional Convention. Now, I want to speak a word for Mr. Murray. I think he was a stalwart of the first degree. He was a man who not only was devoted, but he had made years of preparation. He had received the copies of the Constitution of all of the 45 states that had been admitted to statehood, and he had made a study of them. And he knew also a lot about the government of foreign countries. And that one.
You know, I might, while we're thinking of breaking, you might tell me something about Mr. Murray from a personal standpoint. I'm thinking that, during his latter years, the people who knew Governor Murray, or who saw Governor Murray, including myself, after I came here, he was an extremely sloppy type of personality, and yet I've heard that during the early days that this was different. Could you tell a little about him during the early days from a personal standpoint?
Well, if you want to know about Mr. Murray, he was not a fashion plate, and he would have been a complete failure as a gigolo. He seemed to be all engrossed on government, but he paid little attention to his private appearances. And I can tell you one thing, that about the third day after the convention started, Mr. Murray and I had had a talk, and we both wanted our families up to Guthrie during the convention. So we arranged to make a tour of the city and try to find two houses that was available at the size that would take care of our family. Mr. Murray had married the daughter of the chief of the Choctaw Indians, and they had 8 children, so it took a big house for them. I had just the 2 children, and Miss Young and myself, so a modern-sized house would be all right for us. And in touring the city, we came to an enormous house, and the real estate man said, Mr. Murray said, here's a house that would accommodate your family. But said, I'm sorry, said, it's not modern. Can you cut off? Can you cut it off?
Sure. Your personality.
Bill said, hell, he said, let's go in and look at it. He said, this is the 19th day of November, and he said, we're only going to be here 3 months. And he said, it ain't bathing season anyway. So Mr. Murray took that house. Another thing about his personal appearance, when the Constitution was written and all signed and ready for the election had been called for the submission to approval or rejection, the special interests and some politicians were framing up lawsuits to prevent the submission to the Constitution. And Mr. Murray and I took the original Constitution as signed by the delegates, and he and I as officers, and we hid out. And we were in our hideaway 3 weeks. And Mr. Murray didn't take a change of clothes, underclothes with him. And but he did his laundry occasionally, and he'd hang it on a bronze metal bedstead. And when we got through, that bedstead was a hideous-looking thing, you know. What else?
Well, one of the in the early days there was a great deal of talk about 2 states. The 2 states, you know, the state of Sequoia and the state of Oklahoma. You might talk a little about the controversy and what was involved.
Yeah. Well, now we've told about the convening of the Constitution, but I think we ought to go back to several years during which the people of Oklahoma and Indian Territory were crying for statehood. But it so happened that Indian Territory didn't want any part of Oklahoma. There were 15 conventions held between 1890 and 1905. And as far as the Oklahoma conventions were concerned, and the Oklahoma people, they were all for joint statehood, single statehood with the Indian Territory. But the Indian Territory was absolutely opposed to statehood with Oklahoma. And they went so far in 1905 as to call an election and elected delegates to a convention, and the convention assembled in Muskogee, and they wrote a constitution, and they took it to Washington. But as far as the Congress of the United States is concerned, they didn't even refer it to a committee. They paid absolutely no attention to it, because they, from the very start, the sentiment was for single statehood, and they were adamant in it, and they were we wouldn't have got statehood any other way except jointly between Oklahoma and Indian Territory. And that's it. And they asked for Indian Territory to be admitted to statehood under the name the state of Sequoia.
Was there, in the Indian Territory, was there pretty much agreement that they wanted a separate state, or was there a division there?
Well, there was some division, but I'll say that 90% of the people in the Indian Territory, and I might remark that 34 of those delegates to the Sequoia Convention were elected to the new Oklahoma Indian Territory Convention, and they were all strong men, and I'm satisfied, and I think it is true, that this probably hastened statehood some, because that was in 1905, and in June 1906, the Enabling Act was passed for the joint statehood.
Who in Congress played the important role in getting this Enabling Act?
Well, I don't know. It would seem to be almost a unanimous consensus of opinion that we ought to have one big state. And I'll say this much, that, John Alley, who was a professor of government at the University of Oklahoma, observed that Oklahoma did not have to grow up in swaddling clothes as most of the states had. And he said Oklahoma came in with a bang. The reason Oklahoma came in with a bang was that Oklahoma had more population than any state that had ever been admitted into the Union. And Mr. John Rogers, who has written history of Oklahoma, he said we had 4 times as many people as any other state at the time of admission. And in 1890, the United States Census said it gave more than 400,000. And I know from 90 on, the population increased tremendously, and while we have no record of it, I'm satisfied that Oklahoma had over 1 million people at the time of the admission. And that might sound funny with New York and California, Ohio, Illinois, such states as that, but New York was one of the 13 colonies. As far as Illinois is concerned, they had a great many people taking Horace Greeley's advice, young man, go west, and it didn't have a strong population. And as far as California is concerned, it got a great increase in population in the last 50 years prior to admission of the state. It was then a sparsely settled country, and a good part of the citizens were Mexicans.
Why don't you tell a little about the various controversies that took place and during the proceedings of the Constitutional Convention, and what just kind of relate as it went along?
Well, I don't think it's necessary to talk particularly about the various sections that constituted the Constitution, but there was other chores that the Constitutional Convention had to handle that probably I don't know that any other state had it, and that is that while Oklahoma was divided into sections and county seats designated, yet the Indian Territory was just a great big hunk of country that had never been divided into counties. And one of the biggest jobs of the convention was to divide to establish the county lines in Indian Territory and designate county seats. and people came there by the thousands with their idea of how it ought to be related, and of course it was in their minds was they wanted county seats favorable to themselves because probably they were landowners and things of that kind. And I think if the convention had been even men who would accept a bribe, I think a lot of the delegates could have gotten rich if they'd adhered to some of the cries of the real estate men in the Indian Territory. But I'll say that I just don't believe that there was any favoritism shown at all. They just saw a duty, and I think they'd done it in the best way they could. And I'll say that in our Constitution, we spent 10,000 words in describing the new counties of Indian Territory. Now, as far as Oklahoma was concerned, it was divided into counties. It had county seats, but the counties were large. And the further west you went, the larger the counties were. So there just had to be adjustment of those, and we did split a lot of the Oklahoma Territory counties and made new counties.
You talked a great deal today about there being too many counties in Oklahoma. What's the reason for there being so many counties?
Well, I think there's only 77 in there. I don't know. I don't know a county in the state of Oklahoma that is too large.
Well, no. The thoughts today are that maybe counties are too small. That there should be that there should be less counties.
Well, I don't know. Of course, I've lived in Garfield County, that's Enid county seat, and in Lawton, which is county seat of Comanche County, and I think Anadarko, all of the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache country, I don't know one of them that's too small. And I really am not apprised of any counties in Oklahoma that's too small.
Another thing that I wonder that is a criticism of the Constitution. I thought maybe you could explain or tell what the thinking was. The Constitution of Oklahoma is a very long Constitution and goes into a lot of detail. What was the thinking behind this?
Well, take 10,000 words with reference to the division of the counties, you know. Makes it that way. And another thing that the chore that the Constitution had to do was that the Enabling Act provided that Indian Territory should always be prohibition, and the Osage Nation, that liquor should not be sold to the 5 civilized tribes. And but at that time, we had in Oklahoma side, we had liquor was available below, you know. And I want to make one observation. You know, cocktail parties are very popular now, and liquor was plentiful then in Oklahoma, and I don't remember of a single cocktail party that or any other kind of a gathering that was based on liquor and drinks during the convention. Those men, they didn't pay any attention to 8 hours a day. I want to tell you, you could see lights in that convention hall at in the wee mornings of the hours, and lots of the committees worked on Sundays, different Sundays. We thought we was going to write the Constitution in 90 days, as Mr. Murray had said, but it took 6 months. We wrote it. We signed the Constitution on the 27th day of April, 1907. And then we adjourned, subject to call of the President. And maybe some of the things we put in there was tended to make it long, because it was the most liberal Constitution that ever had been adopted. And we, for instance, had the initiative and referendum. And now wait a minute, is it necessary to tell what they mean?
No.
Well, you know, you could initiate laws and you could kill them. Yeah.
There, of course, were lots of people who played a role in the Constitution who later played an important role in the government of Oklahoma in the years following. Why don't you tell us a little about, and if you can give us any insight into the personalities like you did with Mr. Murray, some of the other important people in the Constitutional Convention, thinking particularly of those who continued to make a role in Oklahoma history.
Yeah. Well, of course, I'll tell you, Indian Territory had a lot of terrifically strong men. You take Charlie Haskell, R.L. Williams, Lee Cruz, and I could name any number of them. And, you know, I think 4 or 5 of the future governors of Oklahoma came from the Indian Territory side.
Well, you've already named 3 of them just then, and I'd like to, since there are not many.
Ledbetter?
Yes.
Well, I don't think he was.
No, he's not a governor, but thinking in terms of there are not many contemporaries of Haskell. I don't know of any. Why don't you tell us what you can about Mr. Haskell?
Well, Charlie Haskell he was connected with railroads in Ohio, and he was a strong character, you know. He really, he was very intelligent, and he had a forceful way about him, and he was one of the leaders of the Sequoia Convention, and I think those 34 men brought into the convention the ideas they had gained by writing the Constitution, the proposed Constitution of Sequoia, and they were familiar more than the Oklahoma people with the actual writing of the Constitution.
And what about Lee Cruz? Tell us something about him. He was the governor.
Well, Lee Cruz was a lawyer and one of the strongest men. I remember he had a big law firm in Oklahoma City, and I had a little experience with him. Moman Pruitt and I were defending a boy by the name of John Hopkins, who was on the fire department in Lawton, and his father had raised horses and had a livery stable, and he had a Negro boy by the name of Tom Cooley, and he raised Tom Cooley, and in the later years the riding kind of died out, and the livery stable business went sour, so Patty Hopkins had accumulated quite a little fortune, and one day he was found murdered, cut his head open with an axe, and they figured that Tom Cooley, who then had moved to Oklahoma City, was the man who had done it. So they arrested Tom and put him in jail, and George Hopkins kept visiting him all the time and taking fruit and drinks up to him, and the next door neighbor swore that they saw George eating at the table with Tom Cooley's family in Oklahoma City while Tom was down killing Mr. Hopkins. And so they finally they thought it'd be smart to turn Tom loose and just see what his relationship was with George. And they did, and while they were in jail, they put a microphone on them and got their conversation that was very damaging to George. And so they finally indicted George, too. And the trial came on. Moulman Pruitt and I defended George Hopkins, and the daughter, there was just one girl, and she had fallen out with her father, and her father disinherited her, and George was the sole heir. And she employed the Lee Cruz firm of Oklahoma, and then she had an extra lawyer from Lawton, had an extra lawyer from Snyder, and had the county attorney and the assistant county attorney. So there were 9 lawyers sitting on one side of the desk, and Moulman Pruitt and I on the other. And of course, we had a county joining Texas, and they'd made a terrible mistake employing a colored detective. And every witness had come on the stand, we'd bring the colored detective in, you know, and that prejudiced the jury because they were anti-Negro at that time. And in fact, a lot of the men in the convention were, including Mr. Murray, was terribly opposed to the Negroes even having full rights of citizenship and the right to vote. And so we had no idea of ever anything else, but we were lucky if we could get a hung jury. And but the jury went out and acquitted George because our whole argument was that there was that big sister, you know, with 9 lawyers crying for the blood of the brother, you know, so that she could become the heir when her father had disinherited her because she was unkind to him. It was one of the most famous cases in Oklahoma.
Now, while thinking in terms of the first gubernatorial election, could you tell about that as you recall?
Well, Frank France, you want me to tell you how he was elected governor? Mm-hmm. The way Frank France happened to be governor was according to the Theodore Roosevelt's idea of men which he had formed from seeing them in action. Frank lived in the town where I did, in Enid. His family was one of the most prominent families there. And Frank was a second lieutenant in the Spanish-American War. And, of course, we had the Rough Riders. And as Frank and his company was marching up San Juan Hill, a sniper shot the captain. So Frank had to take charge of the company. And Theodore Roosevelt was over there. And when he heard it, he galloped up the line, you know. And when he got up to this company, he said, "Young man," he said, "where are you going?" And Frank saluted him, said, "To the top of the hill, sir." And when Roosevelt became governor, Frank France became president. Frank France became governor of Oklahoma. And, of course, he was a Republican nominee against Charlie Haskell. But Charlie Haskell won out by a good majority. And Haskell was a man that he had a temper. And one day, he and J.A. Baker from Wewoka were having arguments, and he picked up a inkwell and threw it at J.A. Baker, and it hit Uncle Clem Rogers on the shoulder and spilled some ink on him, and then came right over my desk, which had been fortunately vacated just seconds before, you know. And he also exhibited his determination and by putting the Great Seal in a suitcase or grip of some kind, and taking the Secretary of State and going down to Oklahoma City here and establishing this as a county seat. When the Enabling Act said that the county seat, the capital, the capital could not be removed from Guthrie till 1913.
What would have happened if he hadn't brought that seal here?
If what?
If he hadn't brought that seal here, would the capital still have moved here?
Well, the capital would have been the capital seat until I think they would eventually vote it out, you know, because there's no comparison between Guthrie and Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City near the center, and it had the Oklahoma spirit, and I think Guthrie was a pretty slow town. The citizens were nice people, but I don't know, it just didn't have the zip and go that Oklahoma City had. And I think it's very fortunate that this was made the capital.
What are some of the things that happened under the Haskell regime as governor?
Well, I didn't understand.
What were the issues of state when Haskell was governor?
Well, I really don't recall what.
Now, the second...
Very strong-minded man.
Haskell came from Arkansas, isn't that correct?
He came from Ohio.
Did he? I thought he had Muscogee.
Well, he lived in Muskogee, but he originally from Ohio, and he was mixed up in the railroads.
I'm going to turn the tape over just one second.